Okay, we're back. The part of that perfect ingredient mix for the uh, industrialization here in the United States had to do with available power. So the traditional power. Whoop, I have my mouse on the wrong thing here. The traditional power that was available was much like the rest of the world, although the U.S. did possess extraordinary amounts of it. So water power, turn mills for grain and things like that. Wood power, we had immense forest resources for the longest time. Coal power came later, and much like Britain, had substantial coal deposits where other countries did not. Um, the U.S. also has substantial coal deposits, and that's still a big industry even today. And so that's going to benefit the U.S. going forward. And coal will be used, for the longest time. The people will get coal deliveries at their house. I know my grandmother lived at a old house that was connected to that used to be part of a textile mill in Alabama, and behind their house was this little bitty shed type thing, and all those sheds were backed up to what were called alleys, which were just really kind of like long driveways that ran behind houses. But their whole purpose was that the deliveries could happen through there, and so the coal truck would come through, and they would actually fill up the shed through a slot in the back of it, and it was just part of that world. And so much of the United States is going to be using coal for quite a long time here, well into the 1900s. But that's not to say that there aren't other things on the horizon, and one of those is what we're looking at here in oil. And it's not going to be immediate. This is not going to be until probably the late 1800s that it really begins to take off, but it does get started around the mid 1800s. But people don't really realize, what it is. There's some places where oil comes to the surface of the ground naturally. People have known about, oil for for millennia, really. But people now begin to realize, oh wow, we've got all this machinery, and at various types of mills and plants, and it needs some kind of a viscous fluid to be able to run better. You need oil in your car. Well, unless you have an electric car, but you need oil in your car. If the engine is going to run properly. If you don't have oil in your car, you're going to need a new engine pretty soon. And it's much that way with industrial machinery. You're going to need some kind of a lubricant to make it work. And so that's what this engine is originally gets used for. A lot of the original extraction of oil in Pennsylvania in the gets started because of that purpose. That's the whole reason that they're hitting these oil locations there. But it doesn't have the same ring to it at the time. It is not, oh, we discovered oil and people get rich all of a sudden. It wasn't like that. By the 1850s, people start to experiment with using it as a fuel, like burning it in lamps, and maybe using it maybe thinking it might be a way to use it as an energy source to produce products and things. And by the 1870s, people really do start to experiment with it and figure out ways to use it as a fuel source. And so it's getting there. It'll take much of the rest of the century for it to get into place. And by the end of the century, it starts to take on that black gold idea, much like the gold rush in 1849. Now there's going to be a new gold rush with black gold. You're going to see that, all over the U.S. You see here in Texas, the first strike was in Spindletop. It's over here towards the Houston side in 1901. So right after the century that we're currently concerned with. But this is the growing nature of oil through the rest of the 1800s. People are saying, oh wow, we need to be searching for more and more of this new resource, and they're able to do pretty well, and especially in Texas. So throughout the 20s, early 1900s, 20s, and 30s, especially, you're going to see lots and lots of efforts in Texas for that to occur. And then you also start to see the major oil companies begin to develop, especially Standard Oil, which we'll talk about in just a little bit when we get to some of the major individuals involved in the industrialization of the United States. And it's important to mention electricity. I believe someone in the class is looking at electricity development for their semester project, but I forget who it was at this very moment. But light and power, it's its own revolution to be able to have reliable, easy lighting outside of the day-night cycle, which humans for the longest time have been beholden to, unless you had a lamp or an oil lamp or a candle or something like that. But people for the longest period were just on that cycle of day and night, and that kind of guided when people worked and when people rested and all that. And so now, as especially 1870s, 80s, 90s, up to the beginning of the century, electricity just starts to become another area of boom investment. So you start to see electric street lighting, electric rails through cities, street cars that run on electricity. Elevators become a thing because of electricity. More and more homes and offices begin to get electricity. You start to get just everything that people can think of. And at the end of the semester, we're going to look at the Great Chicago Exhibition. And you'll see all of the efforts that were put into displaying electricity, just showing people, oh wow, look at this amazing thing that we can do now. And that's a very exciting thing at the time. And so this is just want to mention it here briefly. This is the U.S. Industrial Revolution. As I mentioned, the first was Great Britain, and I just wanted to spell it out clearly for you here. Much like the U.S. in the later 1800s, Britain had the right recipe of things that were happening. It had, solid agricultural production, enough to feed a population that might be, be heading towards a different occupation area, and that becomes industry. So you have the surplus, the ability to shift that labor over to industry, and you also have the abundance of coal, and people start putting that to use into the development of steam engines, and then it goes on from there into powering textile mills and everything else that becomes part of that revolution. And so, fast forward a good 60 years or so, give or take, depending on the situation, you start to see the U.S. take off along with Germany. Those are two of the next ones that really take off and then begin building on what the British have already done. So national communication, national transportation, telegraph, railroads, steamships become a major factor in the United States, especially because, you have the Mississippi River and other major bodies of water within the United States, and so you can make steamships work. Electric power becoming part of it in the 1880s, especially, is when that starts to really take off. And so, and then you start to see a lot of science feeding into the growth of industry and building off of these discoveries that are being made. In the United States, that's even more tightly integrated. Like a lot of the industries themselves are making scientific discoveries and all that. So it's a really important thing that's happening here. And we've mentioned railroads a lot, but I do want to make sure that I spell it out well for you. So this is the first big business, and this was happening before the Civil War, but it's also really, really key now, is that they are putting just enormous amounts of money into building out these rail system, and it's the first big business. Lots of money to be made in it. Lots of investment is happening there. People will, there'll be a few busts occasionally with, financial downturns that are connected with the rail industry, but for the most part, people are really excited about what's happening there. I was making sure I was looking at checking my notes here, make sure I didn't miss anything. It's creating markets. That's what another thing I want to mention to you. It's connecting the United States. Products can get to other places, and people can be excited to own them. And so people in Nebraska could place an order for something that comes out of New York, and it might take a while, but it'll get there. And so that becomes a exciting part of this new world that the United States is creating. And I'm going to skip over the transcontinental line because I believe we've covered that well enough here. And this is the one thing I want to talk to you about. A lot of times people don't dig too deep into business history. It can make people go to sleep pretty quickly. But it's worth noting the importance of some aspects of business history, not just stock market crashes and things like that, but the way things are able to evolve over time and become what they are today. So over time, many smaller companies would merge and or be bought out, and so these companies in the United States are growing and growing, especially the ones that are connected with booming industries, so rail and others. And a lot of these are developing powerful individuals. And with powerful individuals, you start to have people who can make changes or have changes made in the law. That's the way that the world tends to work. And so in the 1830s and 1840s, many states started changing laws so that businesses could raise money by selling stock in their companies. And so after the Civil War, you start to get public companies. So think about it. All the time, if you watch the news, you'll say, "Oh, the Dow was down today," or "Oh, the Dow was up today," or "Oh, Facebook began selling stock and it became this huge bonanza, on Wall Street." And you start to hear, you hear Wall Street, Wall Street, Wall Street. Especially right now, given the current situation with the economic downturn, you start to hear a lot about the stock market, and this is where all that started. Right here in the 1830s and 1840s, it begins to stir, and then by the end of the Civil War, lots more companies start to become public so that people can purchase stocks. And so the question I would pose to you, if we were all sitting here together and you can answer it for yourself, is why does a company sell stock? So I'll give you just a second to think there. Think about ones like Facebook or Amazon or Apple, which is one of the biggest ones right now. Why do they sell stock, like shares of their company? Like you buy that share, you own a piece of that company. Why would they allow that? Why would that? It doesn't make much sense. If you own a company, you think you would want to own the whole company and not have other people owning parts of it. The reason that you sell stock is that it allows a company to operate at a much higher level financially than they would otherwise. So a person comes in and pays $100 for a share of whatever stock it is, then that company now has an extra $100 to build things or buy other companies or do what they need to do to grow, and which is the whole point of a public company, is to grow. And they're kind of beholden to their shareholders to constantly grow, because shareholders are looking for a return on their investment, and so they want that price to expand over time. And so a good example is I like to point out is Facebook. So 2012 is when Facebook began to offer stock, and that gave it an infusion of $100 billion, just a massive infusion of cash. And at the time, and still is, virtual reality, people wearing the VR headsets is a growing area. It still is. Lots of companies are developing it. And one of the leading companies in that was the company Oculus. They had already produced a couple of decent headsets. And Facebook decides, we'd really like to have a virtual reality component underneath our umbrella. And so they take $2 billion and go and buy Oculus. And now that virtual reality component is right there under Facebook. And so that's the sort of thing that these companies can do if they've sold stock and have these massive amounts of cash at their disposal. And so I'll come back in just a second. We'll finish up this part here on corporations.